Now, Prime Minister, thank you very much for presenting that award and for taking the time to be with us tonight, even if it was a bit of a rush to get you here. If you've been caught in traffic, Plan B was to go to online and replay the speech he did last year, which was an absolute ripper. Still getting lots of hits on YouTube, but we're very happy that we can have you here tonight in person and run with Plan A. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to welcome a cartoon artist, a singer. Snoopy's Christmas will never be the same again. He's also barbecue chef to the Royals. Please put your hands together for the Prime Minister of New Zealand, John Key.
Maggie, thanks very much. You know, it is tough getting around Auckland these days on a bulldozer. Can be pretty difficult. I want to start actually by acknowledging Sir Julian Robinson. And last year we took the very rare step actually of giving Julian an honorary knighthood. And it was a reflection on the fact that he's a remarkable person. He's a remarkable New Zealander, we'd like to say. And his contribution to this country and the gift to the Auckland Museum in its own right was just phenomenal, and the largest single act of philanthropy to a museum or art gallery in Australasia, and I think it was so worthy. So, Julian, it's great to see you here and to celebrate you tonight. So Maggie, I'm glad that you mentioned, amongst other things, my drawing. Now, if you have seen any of my doodles in the newspaper, you'll know one thing: I'm absolutely hopeless, right? I mean, it doesn't get any worse than that.
Oh no, you're better than the last Prime Minister.
Yeah, I do draw them. That's true. Okay, I do draw them. Okay,
it's a help. Yeah.
Yeah. True. If you want me to be risque, I can tell you a story in my electorate. Actually, I have Whenuapai Air Base, and it's a wonderful air base, and I took my son out, who was about 11, a couple of years ago, and there was an Australian F111 over here, and the guy was telling us how amazing it was and how quick it could go, and he said to me, do you know, this plane, if we're just flying at its maximum speed, it can fly from Sydney to Melbourne in about 13 minutes. I said, wow, that's remarkable. Our Prime Minister can do that from Waimate to Christchurch, actually. So, quite in an F111. Anyway, you started it, so there you go.
No, you can finish it. You can finish it.
We're here tonight actually to celebrate world-class New Zealanders, and there's so many of them in the room that you wouldn't really know where to start. But it's what makes New Zealand remarkable is that we have people from all walks of life, all disciplines that add to our country and achieve such incredible things both domestically and internationally. As Prime Minister, you get to meet some incredible people, and a lot of people in the room this evening I know and I've had the opportunity to share some company with. But a couple of weeks ago, I had also a unique opportunity to meet someone I guess I never thought I'd really meet, and that was Buzz Aldrin. I had dinner with him, and you feel like a kid when you're asking someone. I mean, he must ask these questions, thousands and thousands of times. He was telling me that, it's interesting actually. Neil Armstrong, Mike Allen, Buzz Aldrin, they were all 80. They were all born in the same year. They're all apparently in good heart and good health. So anyway, eventually as a kid, you sort of start saying, okay, well, were you scared to go on the moon? He said, I'm a lot more scared going on Dancing with the Stars. Don't drop your partner, I said. I've seen it done. It's ugly. So don't drop your partner. But anyway, he said to me, 60 million people watch Dancing with the Stars in America. Isn't that amazing? Almost 60 million people. But anyway, he was telling me about a whole lot of things that he's doing. But I said to him, no, when you went to the moon, genuinely were you scared? And he said, well, look, to be perfectly honest, this is an absolutely true story. He said there was a Nobel laureate that wrote a paper about the moon and published it some weeks before I went up there. And he said that there were these massive holes. I felt like saying, well, they're craters. And he said, no, they're massive holes, and they're full of this dust. And if you walk on them, you'll just disappear and you'll never be seen again. This was the thesis. He got a Nobel laureate for it. So, Nobel Prize for it. And he said, wow. And I said, how'd you feel about that? And he said, I've never been so pleased that Neil Armstrong was 3 steps in front of me. So, there you go. Anyway, there's a few things I just thought briefly I'll talk to you about tonight. I mean, the first is I want to acknowledge Sir Stephen Tindall, and he really is a remarkable New Zealander. Stephen, I think if we could give you 2 knighthoods, we would. And that's a reflection on the fact that he's not only an incredibly talented individual and a hugely successful business person, and a very generous one, he's also a guy that's got great imagination and a great vision for what New Zealand can be. And a recognition that New Zealanders that contribute to this country aren't only New Zealanders that live here. And I think if you look at the power of the Kia network, it really is that it can link New Zealanders all around the world to making us a much stronger country. And while in one sense I lament the fact that so many talented New Zealanders live overseas, the fact that we can draw them into the success of New Zealand is hugely important. Second sort of point I guess I'd want to make to you tonight is that I went last year to Japan. And it was great up there, actually. We went and had a look at some really interesting things there. But one of the things that came through when we were in Japan was just how much that country is still spending on R&D. They are spending about 3.5% of GDP. It's roughly about 3 times what New Zealand spends. And I raise that because as Prime Minister, I was the first Prime Minister in New Zealand's history that's appointed a Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Peter Gluckman, who's with us this evening, who's another very remarkable New Zealander. And I did that because we wanted to put science and innovation at the heart of the government. And in the end, it's about understanding the creativity and the innovation and turning that into something much, much bigger. So why do I raise the fact that they do that? This is what was kind of interesting when we went to Japan. Not that they were doing it. That bit was of itself, mildly interesting. But I started asking the Osaka Chamber of Commerce and the Tokyo Chamber of Commerce and a whole lot of business people, tell me about the R&D tax credits and all this sort of stuff. Not one person could answer that question. Didn't have a clue how their R&D tax credit system worked or whether it was beneficial from a tax perspective or not that they were investing in R&D. And eventually I sort of said to them, well, why are you doing it? And they said, well, it's pretty simple. We're not that terrified of China, although you can have those thoughts about whether you should be or not because of how quickly they're coming up the quality curve, actually, and their cost competitiveness. But they said, fundamentally, we're terrified of Taiwan and Korea. And we know that if we don't innovate fast enough and quick enough and spend more money making ourselves even more at the cutting edge, we can't win. And in the end, Sony's big fear is ultimately Samsung. And I think I raise that point because in the budget we are going to do more when it comes to science and R&D, and Peter's involvement in the government and trying to put a bit of robustness around that thinking has been really important. But I think you as the business leaders of New Zealand also need to think about whether we are doing enough in that space and whether you are doing enough in that space. Because if we're going to win, and that's what this is ultimately about, whether New Zealand's going to succeed at being financially one of the strongest countries in the world, then we're going to have to do it with the stuff that runs from here in our heads and higher up. That's how we're going to become successful as a country. And the second sort of last point I suppose I want to make is that one of the reasons, if you go back and look in political history, arguably, if you want to look at it in terms of terms in office, one of the most successful Prime Ministers in New Zealand's history was Holyoake. And Holyoake actually was Prime Minister of New Zealand at a time where there was tremendous economic growth actually through the 60s and obviously very early 70s. A remarkable time in New Zealand's history, driven off a commodity boom that took place around that time. If you want my view, I think the next decade can be the most powerful period of economic growth New Zealand's seen. I really do. And I think that the dynamics for that are in front of our eyes. They're unfolding every day in what we see in Asia and what we see in China. I mean, just phenomenal growth in China alone, but not just China. And that whole Asian region presents enormous opportunities for New Zealand. And the one thing that's changed is not just their demand for commodities and to buy protein and to buy food and all the things that New Zealand produces, but it is actually the fact that we have one thing that's changed, I think, in the last few years, and that New Zealanders are to a certain degree understanding but not fully capturing. And I think that's ultimately the power of the internet. It's going to revolutionise New Zealand. Just go and have a look at a Facebook site and see how many people are on that. I disowned one apparently this week and I got more coverage out of that than I knew what to do, apparently for no particularly good reason other than she hates me, and that's not a good enough reason to kick someone off a website. But fundamentally, if you look at it, if you really go and look at the power of that internet, it's to capture a worldwide audience from a country like New Zealand. We have always suffered from the tyranny of distance. We've always been the last bus stop on the planet, always an incredibly difficult place to build worldwide distribution. And the internet is going to change that. And it's either going to be a huge opportunity for New Zealand or a huge risk. You know, in my office this week, one of the guys walked in on Monday morning and said, "You like this shirt?" I said, "Yeah, it's nice." Yeah. He said, "Yeah, I bought it online in London on Wednesday, and they delivered it to the house on Sunday morning." That's the threat, but that's also the opportunity. And again, we are pouring a ton of dough, $1.5 billion into building ultra-fast broadband, building huge capability, but the opportunities are just enormous. So, you know, I was looking at a site the other day as the Minister of Tourism. You remember those, you know, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? You wander around the world and you take the sort of 4 books when you're wandering through Europe. They now have technology. You put your mobile phone, your iPhone on the screen. You pay $2.99. You say, "Hey, I'm off to Italy. I'm going to be in Tuscany. This is the bit I'm interested in." You just pick those pages off the screen. You download them onto your mobile phone. You know, for those of you who live in the US or know what I'm talking about, that, you know, you wouldn't go to a restaurant unless you looked up the Zagat's Guide. You know, it tells you whether it's value for money and whether it's got good quality food. They've got this iPhone application. You just pick it up, point it down the street, and it looks at every restaurant and just comes up with the Zagat's rating on that restaurant. There's 1 million applications sitting there on that iPhone. And New Zealanders are hugely creative. A couple of years ago, I met some guys. I said, "What do you do?" They said, "We run a company called Polar Bear Farm." I said, "What does that do?" They said, "Well, we've written the application for a video for iPhone. We've worked it out for Apple has, and they're hosting so many people on that patch that they've had to move that application offshore." So I think as a country, if you really look at the opportunities out there for New Zealand, they are going to be remarkable if we want to grasp them. And I think what you've got to say is, in this room and in this organisation and within the wider bounds of New Zealand, we have the capability to transform New Zealand. The question isn't whether we can do it. The question is whether we want to do it and whether we believe in ourselves enough to do it. And I personally think we do, but I think we've got to take that opportunity and grasp it with both hands. So have a wonderful evening, and congratulations to everyone who's either been a finalist or been successful. You're very worthy of the award, and we all pay our respects to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.